Hello comrades and welcome to the debut episode of SPECTRE, a Scottish-based communist podcast standing in complete and solidified solidarity with the working class of all nations. Today I have the pleasure of being joined by none other than Johnnie Hunter, General Secretary of the Young Communist League of Britain. It's a pleasure to have you, Johnnie.
Hi Nathan, how are you getting on, comrade?
Very well. Just to get started then, Johnnie, just a wee introduction from yourself, a bit of information, who you're affiliated with, what you do and whatnot, just something for our listeners.
Yeah, so as you say, Johnnie Hunter, live up in Glasgow. As you say, I'm very privileged to serve as the General Secretary of the Young Communist League. I also sit on the Communist Party's National Executive Committee. And I'm also a Unison shop steward, and I do a lot of campaigning around peace and international solidarity issues also.
In other words, you're very, very, very busy.
Too many hats, I think, is a consistent theme,
Oh, that's great. Well, as you just mentioned, you're the General Secretary of the Young Communist League. Who are the YCL and sort of what is the work that you do as an organisation?
Yep, well, it's a big question, obviously, a question that I get asked a lot, so I should probably have a more succinct, off the cuff seeming answer than I do, but I'll try and go through it as best and as quickly as I can. So obviously the Young Communist League, we are the youth wing of the Communist Party. I suppose in short, we exist because we understand as communists that capitalism's a decaying and inhumane system, but also that the transition to socialism, the next stage in human development, is something that's essential. And with the unfolding climate crisis, it's something that's increasingly urgent for humanity and for the planet. For communists, we clearly see that there's a need for a communist party to play a vanguard role in that transition to socialism. And we think that the party, in history, we would say, shown us that the party requires a youth wing. So young people don't form, a separate class in Marxist terms, but what we've seen is that young workers and students in revolutionary struggles, both here in Britain, but across the entire world and throughout history, have always played a decisive an energetic role in that struggle for socialism. So our purpose here in Britain, as we would see it, is to fight for peace and for democracy and for socialism in our lifetimes, and in that process to build mass support for the Communist Party and its programme among young people in Britain. Again, I told you it was going to be a long answer, but going at a higher level, I suppose, Lenin said, and this is a quote that gets used a lot by young communists, not just here in Britain, but across the world. Lenin said that the task of young people and young communist leagues is to learn communism. And, by that, he didn't mean, sterile study or, reading books on your lonesome. Don't get me wrong, there is a fair bit of reading involved. But what Lenin meant by that, and what we mean by that, is in the process of educating, training one another, organising with each other, uniting with each other and other young people, and fighting for those progressive causes, we learn communism and we learn how to advance that struggle for socialism and communism. So I suppose, summing up, I would say what we do as young communists and what we're trying to do as the Young Communist League is threefold. On the one hand, we're working to build, as I said, mass support for communism in general and the Communist Party among young people, and also educate our own members and other young people about Marxism, Leninism, what communism is. We're also working in a broad and a non-sectarian way as part of the Labour and the progressive movement. And that's really important. Communists aren't some small insular clique. We're working as part of that broad Labour and progressive movement all across Britain. And as part of our work in that, we're wanting to strengthen that movement organisationally, but also politically in terms of its outlook and in terms of what it's trying to achieve. And in doing both those things, through that work of educating each other and other young people through that work of working as part of the broad movement. What we're trying to do is, train through that work and that study the next generation of Communist Party cadres, and in doing so, building that broad movement and the struggle for socialism in Britain as a whole. So it goes without saying, I suppose you'll be glad to know, to conclude on this point, that all of our members, we would say, are required to be active and to play their part internally as part of the democratic life of the organisation, but also externally as part of that broad movement. So, you'll see YSLers involved in 101 and a growing number of different kinds of activity, from, community propaganda and public meetings, community solidarity, supporting food banks and homeless organisations, education and study, campaigning for the Communist Party in elections, and, as I said, that work in the broad movement, so trade unions on campuses and the student movement, tenants organisations, peace and international solidarity. So I appreciate that was a very long answer, but I suppose that from my perspective would hammer home the point that that's who we are as a YCL, and what we do is quite a lot.
No, that's a perfect answer, comrade. A lot to dissect through. And there, probably the most important part, as you mentioned, that infamous quote by Lenin. I think that's probably the most important thing for any young communist, both here in Britain and indeed across the globe, is to be active within your community. Learning isn't just about reading your books, as you say. It's about how you can implement that in your communities in any way, shape or form. An issue that we have, certainly, in our time, in our sort of generation of youth, too many people are caught up in that online leftism, where they know their stuff, they're very well read up, but they don't get that out to the working class that are out in the street, that don't bother with social media. They're not bothered with being caught up in feuds between social media personalities, because at the end of the day, these things don't matter. These people are concerned about paying their bills, especially now during a cost of living crisis. So what's important is, like you say, it's getting people out there in the street and getting this knowledge transcribed into action, into praxis, and get it out there. With that as well, with the Young Communist League, you are building people as well. It's not just being caught in the same tedious tasks, perhaps. It's not just stagnation in the work itself. Like you're saying, you're building within communities. You're not just repeating the same actions and hoping for a different outcome. Within that building, within that constant development, within various activities, homeless care package work, food banks, and everything else there, it's all about how you can build from it. And with that, as a young communist, you then learn to build yourself as an individual, as a leader, in what you can do. So I think that's probably one of the most important things for any young communist organisation across the globe, is to get there and be active. It's not enough to, as you say, just read. It's how you implement that as well, which I suppose kind of gets us on to our next question when it comes to actually getting yourself involved. It's, how did you first get involved in the YCL, and what sort of led you to this decision?
Well, I blush to say that I'd have to cast my mind back a wee bit. Now I'm getting to the stage where I'm one of the older young communists, but I'll hang on to that mantle of YCLer as long as I can. I joined back when I was 16, so still in high school. So a good while back now. Again, this is probably another one that I've been asked a few times over my time in the YCL, and it's probably another one where I wish I had a better story or an anecdote. I think a lot of people, typically people out with the communist movement, would say, oh, your mum or dad, I suppose they were a communist, and that's why you get involved. What wasn't the case for me. I don't come from a party family. Pretty I suppose simple background for me. I think when I was, as I say, 15, 16, I was quite interested in history. And I think I was one thing that kind of confused me, I suppose, when you're going through high school, you're getting the history of the Second World War, and there's a really big effort. We've seen it then, when I was 16, but it's certainly something that I think it's intensified, in the present day, as this big effort to conflate, Nazi fascism with Soviet socialism, that comes under the blanket term, totalitarianism. So, I don't recall having any, particular strong view at the time, but I think I was confused in that, if we're told consistently, the Soviet Union was, such an evil country, just as bad as, if not worse than, Nazi Germany. I was confused. Why would these people, Soviet citizens, Soviet soldiers in the Second World War, why would they bother to sacrifice themselves in their millions to defend, a system that was evil and oppressive, and that was only maintained through iron discipline and attacks on human rights and all the rest that we're told. So I did some reading on that basis, and I obviously came to the realization that the Soviet Union wasn't that sort of hellscape that is depicted in the mass media and the education curriculum in this country, and that the Soviet Union was a system that could only have ever achieved that defeat in Nazi fascism, but also the stunning gains for working people, that could only ever have achieved all of that with the support and the mass support, and the superhuman effort of working people in the countries of the Soviet Union. So, from there, I thought, well, maybe read a bit of Lenin. What's the worst that can happen? And I've never looked back. And ultimately applied to join the YCL and the party. And I think what happened thereafter is you realise, as you touched on there, that Britain's communists have a really proud and distinct history. There's been changing fortunes in terms of the communist movement in this country, but it's a history that stretches back over more than a century, with some stunning achievements, and a really proud legacy of fighting for working people in this country. And I think for our generation, that struggle, as I said, takes on an urgency that we've probably never seen before, because we really are racing against the clock, I suppose, to save the planet and save humanity from capitalism. And needless to say, I think it's the best decision I've ever made. I'm proud of the work that the YCL do. I've had the opportunity to meet, comrades and other communists from every continent on the planet, and it's been a real source of hope and inspiration in my own life.
That's a great answer, Colin. Again, a lot to unpack there. Sort of similar to my experience as well. It's it all starts sort of in school, I think, for most people as well. And like you said there about the sort of historical revisionism of the Soviet Union and its act in the Second World War, which isn't any surprise given the state's involvement within our public education systems. But certainly for me, in my experience, came from a obviously working class family and very much sort of tribal voters, whether it be on my mother's side as Labour or my father's side as SNP. And when you're a young person, perhaps you might fall into the trap and side with your parents and stick to that because it's all you know. But as I sort of got older and sort of looked around and seen the conditions around me, especially here in Scotland with the SNP, where they peddle themselves as being these progressive champions and changing the very livelihood of Scots within this country. But anything that I've seen with the SNP being in power, it's never improved. It's always scapegoated onto Westminster, which, yeah, can 100% argue there's certainly involvements within there and their continued work to create class divisions across Britain. But certainly with the SNP and the work that they failed to do was certainly an eye-opener to me. And I suppose that's when I started having second thoughts, both about independence and everything else in between. And that sort of led me to expand my knowledge, like you said, started reading more. Fortunately, with us being unfortunately with us being the social media generation, started following lots of accounts online, stumbled across the Young Commoners League and saw this sort of the difference in work and just how active they were. And they always seem to be there at a picket line or a protest and anything anywhere else in between, standing side by side with people, not off to the side, you know, peddling merchandise and whatnot. They were always at the forefront, being the very vanguard of a youth movement, which was very inspiring. And that led to me joining last year during the Palestine demonstrations. And like you said, you know, it's been the best decision made. I've never once looked back, and it's been one of those fantastic moments. Like you say, you meet so many people from across the globe, so many dedicated communists from England, from Wales, and everywhere else in between. It's been one of those fantastic things. And I guess that sort of leads us on to probably the biggest question that folk are still on the fence have when it comes to joining a sort of a young communist organisation, is that, you know, what makes the YCL different from other sort of like political organisations? You know, what's the ideology and the work that you use within your system?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's an excellent question. I'm very glad to hear as well. I'll note that you're not regretting your choices. Always a good sign.
I'm in too deep now.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. We've got you. You've signed in the dotted line. You know, I think obviously a lot to unpack there in terms of, you know, what we would say makes us different from, you know, other political youth organisations. You know, obviously as you'll be aware, I think anyone, even a brief time in the left, you know, there's a proliferation of different groups claiming different things. And you know, I would always say at the outset for a question like this, you know, we're not a sectarian organisation. We are really clear that what Britain's broad Labour movement, the Labour and Progressive movement, what it deeply needs is unity, and unity around, you know, revolutionary socialism. But at the same time, you know, we are clear that the Communist Party and the Young Communist League do play and have to play a unique and a historic role in the struggle for socialism here in Britain and you know, across the world, and that's for a number of reasons. Britain's communists, we would say, have consistently punched above our weight in terms of our contribution to that movement, you know, providing that movement with an ideological and a strategic underpinning, but also, you know, the contribution of individual communists and the collective strength of the party and different struggles that have taken place over the last 100 years, those struggles in defence of working class communities and working people, and that struggle for peace and against imperialism as well. And I think if you look internationally, you know, one thing I think that, you know, was certainly, you know, very powerful for me is that, you know, over the past more than 100 years now, since the Russian Revolution, you know, it's only been communist parties that have ever, you know, successfully challenged imperialism and taken power into the hands of working people, and, you know, set on that historic and that difficult task of building socialism. And, you know, that's a journey that, but, you know, these countries are still on today, and that, you know, most countries and nations of the world still need to go down. So I think, you know, if I had to kind of summarise what you know, makes the YCL different from other youth organisations in Britain, I suppose in the first place, you know, we're Marxist-Leninists. We would say that's scientific socialism. So we're part of that ideological tradition that unites communists all across the planet, building on the works of Marx, Engels and Lenin, but also the experience of communist parties in socialist countries since the Great October Socialist Revolution. And, you know, that doesn't mean that we say, you know, the Soviet Union is a blueprint, or China is a blueprint for socialism here once we've achieved working class state power. But it's saying that theory, that rich and developed theory, is something that we creatively apply here. You know, those ideas and those strategies, we creatively apply them to Britain's circumstances, and, you know, that's summed up in our programme, Britain's Road to Socialism. Organisationally, you know, as a Marxist-Leninist organisation, we are organised according to the principle of democratic centralism. So that means that, you know, we have the fullest democratic debate internally on questions of policy or strategy, and, you know, we give all comrades at all levels of the organisation as full an opportunity to contribute to that debate as meaningfully as possible. But once we reach a decision democratically, that's something that each and every member and every part of the organisation unites around and carries forward in our work. And, you know, I think when we see with the levels of infighting across the left in Britain, unity is the most powerful tool that working people have, and if you can't embody that in your own organisation, you're I think set up to fail against the weight that the British state and the ruling class can throw at you. So we're proud of that approach of democratic centralism. Again, that's something that characterises all communist movements, and like all communist movements, as I said, we're part of the mass movement in our own country. So we're non-sectarian. For us, it's about building up the mass organisations of working people, trade unions, progressive organisations, to carry forward that broader struggle, the struggle for immediate aims, but also that struggle for socialism. And as I said, we're internationalists. So for us, it's not about having tunnel vision about what's occurring in Britain. We do have links with parties and movements on every continent. That informs our own analysis of the struggle here in Britain, but also that informs our struggle against British imperialism. And for Britain's communists, the struggle to defeat the imperialism of our own ruling class. Of course, it's British imperialism is a horrific legacy across the entire planet. For us, that's one of our foremost duties. And, we're also socialists. That goes without saying. There's a lot of people that would say that they're socialists in Britain, of course, that might have a different conception of what that means. But, we are, as I said, scientific socialists, but we're also revolutionary socialists. We think that capitalism can't be mended. It's something that's got to be ended. It's a system that is inhumane, decrepit, and it's not only holding back humanity, placing immense swathes of humanity in grinding poverty and in destitution. It's also something that's threatening to destroy the planet and destroy its ability to sustain human life within our lifetimes. So I don't think, from my perspective, and there's certainly no sectarianism or no arrogance in saying this, but I don't think there's another organisation that offers the opportunity to young people to train themselves as communists, or offers the same opportunity to throw themselves into that struggle for peace, democracy and socialism in the same way that the YCL does. So I would say that maybe the difference in a phrase would be, we're serious about socialism, and we want young people that are serious about socialism to be members of the Young Communist League.
Well, it's a great answer there, comrade. Fantastic insight in terms of the YCL's structure and certainly the ideological principles in which it's operate under. Before to move on, probably a very topical question, certainly here in Britain, and it was one aspect that had to be explained to me several times till I understood it, till its full grasp, was progressive federalism. Here in Britain, the idea of independence across Scotland and Wales is obviously a very topical issue. As you mentioned previously, we know people who are, claim to be socialists and whatnot, who might fall under different sides to this argument and whatnot. But wondering if you could share your thoughts or maybe explain what progressive federalism really means, and sort of the reason for the idea of progressive federalism, and how it's more beneficial for the workers of Britain than separating from each other.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's obviously a very big, pertinent question up here in Scotland. I think it would be fair to say that since the independence referendum, during and since, it's been a really dominant feature of the political landscape and of political debate up here in Scotland. I think it would also be fair to say that probably the stance of the Communist Party and the YCL in terms of advocating progressive federalism is unique on the movements and the parties to the left of the Labour Party. So for the Communist Party, in terms of progressive federalism, the starting point for us is, of course, that Scotland as a nation does have the right to national self-determination. That's a matter of principle, and it's something that communists have always advocated. But at the same time, we also argue that the question of how that right to national self-determination should be exercised should also be guided by class principles. What advances the ability of working people in Scotland, and to an extent working people across Britain, to challenge the power finance capital. So those were the principles on which we've always approached this question, and it's a question that the Britain's and Scotland's communists have considered. For a long time, we've played a very prominent role in the campaign for the creation of a Scottish Parliament. But when we had the question of the referendum, and the SNP plan outlined in their white paper for independence, we were forced to conclude that was an independence in name only. Key features of that white paper were that Scotland would retain the pound. So that would give you the position where probably a perpetually Tory parliament down in England, or what would be a Tory parliament for a significant period of time, would have control over monetary policy in Scotland, and quite a strong veto over any progressive plans by a Scottish government. That plan was also predicated on Scotland entering the European Union as an independent country, and that's something that's even more strongly part of SNP plans now. And for us, that would involve the surrender of more powers than ever before to a foreign international body. And if you look at the legacy of the European Union, it's hardwired to neoliberalism, to attacking the rights and the living standards of working people, is increasingly militaristic and is also increasingly anti-democratic. You would also have the position, and again the SNP have only reinforced their support for this, that Scotland would have become a NATO member. So it wouldn't have been the case that it would have removed Scottish soldiers and Scottish funding from foreign wars, and there's also no guarantee that it would have removed nuclear weapons from Scotland. So, we considered that in that context, we couldn't support the plan that was being outlined by the SNP, but that certainly doesn't mean that we're happy and we're content with the status quo in Britain. Britain is obviously a capitalist country with a deeply flawed democratic model, not just at the level of Westminster, but in the way that power and resources and democratic accountability are distributed between the regions and nations of Britain. So in that context, we call for what you've said as progressive federalism, and apologies for taking so long to get to the point of the question without the intro. I'm just too used to talking about Scottish independence, obviously. But the idea behind progressive federalism is that working people across Britain, primarily through the British Labour movement, do have a very strong legacy of shared struggle for progressive gains that we've seen in the welfare state, and the many other things that we take for granted but are having to defend in the present era, but also a history of shared struggle for socialism. So the question for us is, how do you best mobilise that against finance capital? And finance capital is something that's primarily organised in the City of London. So communists advocate for a new constitutional settlement based on increased powers for the parliaments in Edinburgh and in Cardiff, but also for much greater devolution to the regions of England, to have them, allow them to have a much bigger say and how democracy takes place in those parts of the country, but also to allow for a radical redistribution of wealth away from London and the southeast of England. Because for us that's really a fundamental point. If you did have the breakup of the British state as it exists, what you would really end up with is a breakup of the British state as it is currently advocated. We consider would have a high likelihood of leading to a race to the bottom between the former nations, Wales, England and Scotland. What you would have is these different governments competing to offer capital that's organised in the City of London. You would have these now separate governments competing to offer the best conditions for investment. And what that means for working people is privatisation of services, low wages, and also attacks on trade union rights and other living standards. And again, capital would continue to be organised in London. And what would that mean for the people of Scotland? That would mean that the economy would be dominated now by a force which we would have no control over, no democratic control, Whereas, we consider, and again, we're not unrealistic about this. We know that there needs to be major developments in that struggle for a progressive movement, not just in Scotland, but across the whole of Britain, that could carry forward these demands and carry forward the kind of extra parliamentary movement that would be needed to achieve this. But we consider that British Labour movement, that strong legacy of cooperation, and the current reality of cooperation between millions of workers and a growing number of workers for the first time. It's a strategy that needs to be tested and practiced, and updated based on the results. But we're clear that unity always has been and always will be a strong tool for working people, not just in Scotland, but across Britain. And the right-wing separatism that's offered by the SNP at present is a dead end for working people. We're clear on the right of Scotland to national self-determination, to conduct a referendum if that's what the Scottish people wish. But in the current context, I think that our priority is fighting, firstly, against the current escalating militarism and imperialist war that we're seeing in Europe. We're also very clear about the urgent need to fight to save the planet, but also to tackle the cost of living crisis that's occurring in Britain just now. So for us, pursuing Nicola Sturgeon's, we would say, right-wing plan for independence is not a fundamental priority for working people in Scotland just now, and for working people in Britain, a key part of the progressive strategy to beat this Tory government and to create a movement that can beat this Tory government in the immediate term. That's something that does need to be based on a strategy of progressive federalism.
Fantastic answer there again, comrade. Really, really well explained in talking about the necessity for unity in itself. I think it comes down to the very fundamentals, like you said. It's what we've got in common as workers, and that what we have in common is the very toil and the very struggle against capitalism and how it exploits us. For me, it was one of the most opening things. It really pushed me further over to the left, I guess you could say. It was this understanding that I've got more in common with your average working class Scouser than I ever will with some toff living down at the borders, but I'm supposed to feel inclined in unity with them because they've got a Scottish passport. That's one of the major things that sort of tipped me over the edge, I guess you could say. And as you says, battling the white paper of the SNP's plans and whatnot, the determination to get back into the European Union, and as you well explained, it's vast expanses of neoliberalism, its failures to combat fascism, racism, all other political strives that are occurring within its so-called union, been really transparent over the past few years. Not to mention, its ties to imperialism. It's cannot survive without conflict, and it thrives off it. There's so many people involved within the arms dealings across Europe, and indeed across the globe as well, especially to major imperialists such as America. It's all part of that global trade. One of the probably more topical points recently has been, again, we've seen the SNP fall back in itself and its claims of being progressive. They've said they don't want nuclear weapons in Scotland, yet recently they've stated they'd be happy to temporarily hold on to them, falling back on this argument, which sold a lot of people who are quite rightly against war, as any human should be, but they've fallen back on these promises, all for what we know is going to be profit and trade and capital at the end of the day. But yeah, fantastic point and really worked into. And as you said earlier about the very structure of the YSL, its ideological principles with being Marxist-Leninists, one of the most frequently used keywords to describe very active Marxist-Leninist groups is always the word Stalinist, always used by these sectarian reactionary forces in describing such strong and stable groups. How does the YSL sort of combat these forces and their attempts of historical revisionism and division, both against the former Soviet Union and today with the revolutionary history of the British working class?
Yeah, I mean, I dare say I've heard the term a few times in my time. Sure, I've been called it a good few times as well. I think it's pretty tired Cold War era rhetoric. But it's rhetoric that you hear certainly both from the right wing and the monopoly media, but also from elements of the ultra left. For my part, I don't think Stalinism is a valid phrase or a valid term. I'm not particularly sure what it's supposed to mean or purports to mean, and I'm pretty sure if you asked the different collections of folk that use the phrase, I think they may struggle to tell you as well. As you say, I think, and as we touched on earlier, there's been a massive and concerted attempt by capitalist governments, capitalist states, the media that they control, and the elements of the academia that they control, to conflate Nazi fascism and Soviet socialism, sometimes termed Stalinism, to conflate them as totalitarianism. And you've seen that as a really intensive effort, again something in part directed by the EU, also by the United States and the various NGOs that the government and the CIA sponsor there, but also by our own government. You see it a lot in the curriculum, the school curriculums, and you see it a lot in the state media through the BBC, and also the privately owned media. And I think it's something that's really been heightened as well by the conflict taking place in Ukraine. These bizarre, and misguided attempts to, label the current Russian government socialist or communist, and Putin as a communist, ignoring the fact that these are the very people, the very vultures that played an active part in the destruction of socialism in the USSR, and people who are by no means socialists or communists. For our part, the Young Communist League is very clear on the historical importance and the legacy of the USSR. After the Paris Commune, it was the first place where working people achieved state power and set about constructing a new form of society, socialist society. Of course, in the context of that long and first effort, there are of course lessons to be learned, errors that have been made. I don't think that's ever been the case in the transition from one form of society to another, or in any experiment. The transition from feudalism to capitalism took hundreds of years across the whole planet, and that was by no means a seamless process. And socialism, it's a planned attempt to construct it, but of course there are going to be errors made along the way. But despite that, what was achieved in the Soviet Union was remarkable. You had an economy built up, an industrialization on a scale hitherto unknown in human history, that only surpassed really by what's happened in China more recently. For working people, that meant massive rises in living standards. For working people across the Soviet Union, that meant having access to free healthcare, housing, education for the first time in their lives. It meant that working people were guaranteed a livelihood and a right to work for the first time in their lives. It meant for minorities, national minorities and women, that they were respected in society, had the same democratic rights as others, and could play a full and meaningful role in society. And for national minorities, their cultures and their languages were celebrated and protected, whereas in the capitalist West and in the colonies that were controlled by the capitalist West, they were being violently suppressed and subjugated. So despite the immense difficulties faced by the USSR, and let's talk about those difficulties, that was first emerging from the First World War, the bloodiest war in history at that time. They emerged from that straight into a civil war in which 14 imperialist countries tried to intervene and destroy Soviet socialism, as Winston Churchill said, strangle the Bolshevik baby in its cradle. They were unsuccessful. They were only unsuccessful because of the superhuman efforts of the Soviet people. Thereafter, the Soviet Union knew it had to industrialize rapidly to protect itself from the war that was coming from the fascist powers, Nazi Germany in particular. And these were fascist powers that were being encouraged and enabled by the capitalist West, the so-called democratic West. And after the Soviet Union had won that war, not only on its own behalf, but on behalf of working people across the entire world, they, and a great cost to the Soviet people, a tragic cost, they then had to prepare for the Cold War that was being launched by the newly strengthened America and its other allies and NATO and their development of nuclear weapons. But despite that, the Soviet Union continued to deliver massive social, economic and democratic gains for people, not just in the Soviet Union, but across Europe and the expanded socialist camp. And it also supported anti-imperialist movements, anti-colonial movements and socialist revolutions all across the globe. And, obviously, if the Soviet Union, if it was a perfect state, it would still be here today. It wasn't. And lessons are there to be learned for working people, for the countries that are continuing to build socialism today, and for communist parties that are fighting to build socialism in our countries. But it wasn't a country that was destroyed because people were crying out for capitalism. What they wanted was a better socialism, and that movement was hijacked by people like Putin and other oligarchs and vultures. And we see the results of that today. The biggest peacetime drop in living standards and in life expectancy in modern history. And we also see the tragic results of that in Ukraine. Two countries which were sister nations in the Soviet Union, Russia and Ukraine, are now fighting a horrific war in the year that we are living, and civilians are being killed. And it's a tragic situation when you consider the shared history of those countries and the shared struggles and what had been created in the Soviet Union. But for us, in terms of combating that attempt to, as you say, obscure history, that attempt to conflate Soviet socialism and Nazism, in terms of the kind of tired attacks that you get from other people who would consider themselves left wing. We're really not particularly interested in insular left wing infighting. Having the same arguments and debates that have been taking place for decades. We're confident about our politics and our ideology, and we're also confident about our struggle. And our ability to build the struggle for socialism in Britain. There are millions of young people out there who are already sympathetic to socialism, or who just need that contact from young communists and that push to get involved in the struggle. That's where we want to be. We don't want to be talking to the same circles. But the more important point I would say is that we do need to combat the misinformation, the historical revisionism and the distortions that are taking place in the state education system and in the monopoly media. It goes without saying that there is a big difference, a fundamental difference between the people who built the concentration camps and the people that liberated the people who were in those concentration camps. And it's sickening the extent to which the education system in Britain and the monopoly media are prepared to try and conflate the two. But these are the tactics of the ruling class. So there's a battle of ideas that has to be conducted, and we're clear about our role in that. And for us, the resources like Challenge, the magazine of the Young Communist League, and the Morning Star are really pivotal in that battle. But of course, a stronger and more visible YCL is also really fundamental in that battle of ideas.
Wow, yeah, another great answer there, Cromwell. As we mentioned, Stalinism it's not got any form of ideological basis to it. It's like we say, it's often used by those reactionaries, those right wingers, as this way to tarnish those who defend the achievements of the Soviet Union. And as you say, it's quite rightly sickening to the extent in which it's used. This idea of tarring it with Stalinism all comes down to fascist propaganda, first used by Nazi Germany, then resurging with the likes of the CIA and other capitalist branches, developing this outwards again. And I think that's probably a big thing that might put somebody's not got a grasp 100% on the very history of what's happened, like you said, with the state's influence within the education system, and what they are spoon-fed and what we've all been spoon-fed with our times in schools and whatnot. We're often told that almost Britain's single-handedly done it, when it's just a flat-out lie. And we've seen the very damaging effects of the usage of the word Stalinism and that continued tarnishing of young communists, and even indeed young socialists who might not be in line with a communist party but can still rightly defend the history of the Soviet Union and its achievements. And they've been used to tarnish their reputations and almost blacklist them within the public's eye. But certainly, as you mentioned, within the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, as you quite rightly said, these were sister nations. Ukraine especially, infamous for the sacrifices that the people made there in combating fascism, and now with this growth of propaganda, anti-communist propaganda being pushed, peddled and force-fed down the throats of naive Western apologists and the suffering working class within Ukraine who are forced to flee currently, it's contributing to the rise in fascism, not just in Russia and Ukraine, but indeed Eastern Europe, and expanding westwards. You've probably had smaller factions of this within the EU, but those are rising. They're rising for one reason in particular. It's because the EU does not combat it. It's not in their principles to combat it. This class division, this fight is profitable, and that's a fundamental that's used with this propaganda to create further divisions, to distort history, and to just outright lie. And you made the very good point. There's a clear difference between those who built the concentration camps and those who tore them down. And that's probably the most important fact for any young communist or any young person, any person indeed across the globe to remember. With that being said, when it comes to this ideological battle, these battle of ideas, it's probably one of the most debated ones between left groups across the globe, is the idea of utopian and scientific. You touched on previously the young communists focusing on scientific socialism. So how have you and the League as a whole employed this scientific theory and transcribed it into what's necessary as the appropriate and effective praxis?
It's an interesting question, certainly, and for us, there's quite a nice local connection. Near Glasgow, you've got New Lanark, which was obviously one of the great utopian socialist experiments. Robert Owen, a proud part of the history of the movement here in Britain. The difference between utopian and scientific socialism is, one of the fundamental things for communism as an ideology. The way that we will build up a socialist society is not something that can pop out preformed, that you've got the perfect plan and all you need to do is implement it from the head of one particular genius. It's got to be a theory, a scientific theory based on experience, based on observing how the strategies and the tactics that you're applying, how they in fact work, and developing and enriching that strategy and that approach based on those observations. So it's about not coming to it with preconceived notions of what will work and what won't, but creatively applying that strategy and developing your work in that way. So as young communists, as I said, one of our fundamental priorities is to educate our members, educate one another, and young people in general on Marxism-Leninism. As I said, we have a programme, Britain's Road to Socialism, where the party and the YCL have set out our approach to building that struggle for socialism here in Britain. And, we work to test that theory in practice, through applying it, not just at the national level or at the regional level, but at the most local level, where our branches are organised in different parts of different towns and cities. And what we do is we update it according to real world developments and according to our analysis of how that strategy and how those tactics have worked. And, we do that regularly through congresses, but also, week in, week out through active debates and discussions about our work and about the political value of our work in branches and in districts. And I think as well, when we engage in any political work as the YCL, we try, I suppose, not to be too high-floating about it, but we do try and approach it in a scientific way. So we plan what we're going to do in advance. We think about what are our immediate aims with this work, with this action, what's the political objective here, what's the immediate outcome that we're seeking to achieve, but also what's the long-term outcome, how are we planning to develop this over the longer term, and fundamentally, how do we make that happen? And once we've carried out the work, which of course always goes flawlessly, but you learn hard lessons, but with successes as well as failures. But we always critically assess the work after it's taken place. What went well, what didn't go well, how do we improve it in future? How do we update our strategy, taking into account the work that's been carried out? And what were the successes and what were the failures? So, we would like to think that we approach our work again with a scientific approach, with a professionalism, and with a determination to learn according to how it occurs, not just say, well, this is how it's always been done, this is how we're always going to do it, and knock our heads against the wall and run ourselves into the buffers. It's about taking that professional and that scientific approach to political work.
Aye, absolutely, comrade. The infamous saying, the revolution will not be televised. You can't come into this revolutionary class struggle with these fallacies for some people of glory or whatnot. It's nothing like that. It's constant struggle. I've seen it as my time in the YSL, and indeed out with in my trade union work. It's the conditions that we're seeing in Britain. They're getting worse. People are really struggling under this cost of living crisis. People in my work having to take payday loans, food bank collections, relying on loans from family members and that. And it's these very conditions that we have to assess, we have to analyse to their fullest extent, and as you say, really plan out, how do we combat this? How do we then develop it once the work has been carried out? And like you mentioned before, in terms of the YCL does in that, is then criticising that work, not patting yourself on the back and go, oh, we'll see if it changes next time. No, it's about analysing mistakes, analysing flaws, and then building that. So when next time comes around, it's a much stronger unit in the basis of your work. And this idea of the utopian socialism, or this idea that it's going to occur after just one simple act, is completely false. Often peddled by your son journalist. They'll have this idea Jeremy Corbyn's going to seize control of the BBC and the revolution will happen tomorrow. It's not like that at all. It never comes from just one strict swing. It always has to come from a basis of development, and that's certainly what we're seeing today. The last question I want to sort of cover on, I feel this is obviously, I think that's a very debated one within the left as a whole, is socialist patriotism. What is it, and why do sort of folk in the left, or your online left especially, see that the very notion of working class British people being proud of their history?
Yeah, it certainly is a big topical one, as you say. I think maybe there's some importation here, not just from Twitter, but maybe debates that are taking place in the left in the United States. It might be the case that the less that we take from there, the better. But I'll leave that up to yourself. It certainly is, on a more serious note, it certainly is an important debate for the left here in Britain. I think, as we already touched on, that it's got a big relevance in Scotland, given the debates on the national question that have been taking place, continue to take place, and will continue to take place. Again, for Britain's communists, we're very clear on the right to self-determination. For the nations of Britain, and nations for communists are a historical fact in human development. They've been around for thousands of years. Obviously become more formalised and taking on new characteristics in recent centuries. And for communists, they've been a big, subject of discussion and debate in terms of our strategy for winning socialism and building socialism. Lenin, really applied his mind to the question of nations. Obviously, the Soviet Union was a multinational country based on what had been the Russian Empire, which had subjugated various different nations. So it is a big question for communists, and for communists in Britain, it's got the added, the added dimension of what does patriotism or an approach to the nation mean when you're in an imperialist country. So Lenin correctly identified that in every nation there will be a bourgeois culture, and there will be a working class culture, and it's the case that under capitalism, it's the bourgeois culture that is the dominant one in the nation, and we see that in Scotland, we see that in Britain. The ideas of nationality are sometimes are very often tied up with militarism, and the right wing and regressive aspects of British history and the British state. I think that's one of the dangerous things about nationalism, both at the British level, but in certainly here in Scotland as well, because it fosters this myth that working people, just because we were born in the same country as members of the ruling class, have something fundamentally in common with them. But as communists, we are very clear that working people, be they Scottish, English, or Welsh, they have nothing in common with our exploiters, nothing in common with the ruling class on a moral and intellectual or a cultural level. As you very correctly said, Nathan, and that's a line and a point that I've made many a time, I've got far more in common with a working class person down in Cardiff or London or Liverpool than I do with, some Highland laird or a big farmer down in the borders. So nationalism, bourgeois nationalism, is dangerous because it fosters that myth of class collaboration. So as Lenin said, nations, there's a bourgeois culture, but there's also a working class culture. And I think the task for communists, democrats, progressives, trade unionists is to foster what is progressive and democratic and socialist in that national culture. And there's certainly a lot to be proud of in the progressive struggles of working people, not just here in Scotland, but across Britain. We've got going all the way back to the diggers and the levellers down in England during the Civil War. But there's that whole shared history of the trade union movement that spans decades and well over a century, and we've also got all the contemporary examples of the progressive struggles that are taking place here today. One of my proudest parts of Scottish history is the massive struggles that took place in the post-war period. Here in Glasgow, we've got the UCS working. So there's plenty to be proud about, to be a Scot that is progressive and democratic and socialist. And I think the key, as I said, is for us to make those the dominant elements of what it means to be Scottish, of what it means to have Scottish national identity, just as it is for comrades to do the same in England or in Wales. And I think it's a real mistake for people to fall into the trap of abandoning the idea of patriotism or the idea of nationality to the right wing, because it is a powerful tool and it's a dangerous tool when it's in the hands of the right wing or even fascist forces. We shouldn't allow them to define what it means to be Scottish or English or Welsh. For us, it is a democratic, a multicultural and a socialist national identity. And that, for the left, can be a powerful tool. And if you look at countries like the Soviet Union previously, but countries like Cuba, China and Vietnam today, these are countries with strong socialist patriotism. So they're celebrating, as I said, that progressive past, that role of the nation in constructing socialism in the present, but it's also socialist patriotism that's tied up with internationalism. We're celebrating that struggle of working people across the world for socialism, and the role that solidarity plays in that. So I think that we want to probably avoid some of the rabbit holes that Twitter can lead to, but we certainly can't abandon the idea of patriotism to the right wing. and we have a duty to win that battle of ideas again that's taking place on the question of the nations of Britain.
I comment, as you've rightly mentioned there, we'll never have anything in common with our oppressors, our exploiters. We don't share any form of true history with them. Our idea of patriotism is in the acts of defiance against them. We look in Glasgow, as you've mentioned, the UCS working. We also had the Red Clydeside in England, such as the YCL history, the mass trespass of Kinder Scout. And that's what we are proud of. That's what makes us patriotic of our countries, because it's what we want it to stand for. It's this defiance against the state that really solidifies us, even in modern times, especially in the height of all the immigration and night raids going on, when we're seeing so many people storm the streets and fight against the state and their continued efforts to deport people from here. And we saw it in Kenmure Street. We've seen it in Edinburgh as well, and down in England. And it's this constant fight against the state and interest of capitalists. It really makes you proud to be from that country, like you mentioned as well, with Cuba and the former Soviet Union. I mean, where would they be in their fight right now if they weren't proud of their countries? Like you say, you run into this problem of fascists and right-wingers taking over of what it means, and that ultimately results in exploitation. That's at the fundamentals of what keeps them in top and keeps the workers at the bottom. And not to mention, if we didn't have that idea of patriotism within the Second World War, I mean, the spirits of those fighting from the Soviet Union would have been dwindled. This idea you've got nothing to fight for because of the past history of the imperialist empire of Russia, then it would all dwindle away. But as you says, a lot of these sort of arguments do stem from your online left. You might get yourself into a Twitter rabbit hole, shouting into the void, trying to explain something to somebody who doesn't want to listen. But the fundamental factor is that we're going to make our own history, and we know what's good, what's bad, and it's what we're fighting for, what makes us proud of our nations and what we want them to stand for. It's never going to be the case of siding with imperialist history and whatnot. I suppose Scotland gets off lightly there. I think it's our comrades in England who take a slagging for that.
Yeah, no, I absolutely, and that's an important point that I think forgot to touch on. There's a big effort, I think, to rewrite Scottish history as if we were. You've even heard people claim Scotland was a colonial victim in the same way Ireland or India was. The reality was, Scotland was our ruling class were willing partners in the empire and played a massive role in the subjugation and exploitation of foreign people across the whole of the planet. There's a reason that Glasgow's got a Jamaica Street, that the merchant city's so opulent. It's because it was the second city empire, and I think that attempt to rewrite Scottish history as if we were joint victims with our ruling class, rather than our ruling class was a willing partner in empire and exploited us and the oppressed peoples of the world, along with the English ruling class. I think that's quite a dangerous myth that's perpetrated, and it's also a myth that I think contributes to that class collaboration that's behind quite a lot of Scottish nationalism. It's the English that are the enemy. It's not the English that are the enemy. It's the ruling class, and it's a British ruling class organised in the City of London.
Yeah, absolutely. You perfectly mentioned there the rewriting of history, especially in the context of Scotland. Even looking at feudal times, who was it who sold Scotland off to join the then English Empire? It was your lords, your Scottish lords, your noblemen who sold off the peasants because it worked in their best interest. This idea of victimhood, is very stemmed within that idea of sort of the reactionary independence front. But certainly for us, combating the negatives and the argumentives for our fight for patriotism is a lot of that stemming from the idea of rewriting history to what it means. It's that very threat that we did mention, and it's certainly used here in Scotland, and it just creates further class divisions, as we've noted before. Finally, just any last talking points you might have, anything you want to mention?
I suppose my final point, keeping it brief, which hasn't been my forte today, but I suppose for anyone listening to this, thinking about getting involved, getting more involved in political work and political action, capitalism is a bankrupted system economically, ideologically, and morally, and it has nothing to offer working people and young people in Britain or anywhere else around the world. But it's not enough to come to that realization. The oft-used phrase, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything, I think is very true. It's not enough to know what you're against, you need to know what you're for. And we're clear the solution to the crisis, the existential threat facing young people, facing humanity, is socialism, is revolutionary socialism. And that's not a struggle that can take place tomorrow or next year. It's an urgent one, because the reality is that the clock is ticking for capitalism to poison the planet, to destroy it. But there's always reasons to be hopeful. It's we don't have the luxury of despair, and I think it's an exciting time to be a communist, to be a member of the YCL, to be a member of the Communist Party. So I suppose my final point, my call out would be for people who are serious about socialism. Now is the time to join the YCL and the Communist Party. Now's the time to join that struggle. And 2 for 2 here, but I would say I can guarantee that you won't regret it.
Excellent comment, brilliant. And where can people find sort of the YCL on social media and that? Where can we find you?
So we've long gone are the days when I was managing any of the social accounts. So they're very much better than they ever would have been during my time. But you can get all the national accounts at YCL Britain, and you also find I'm sure a branch where or near to wherever you are, and we've also got Scottish pages as well, which are very vibrant and give a good idea and regular updates on what we're getting up to in Scotland and in different towns and cities.
Brilliant. Well, thanks again, comrade, for joining me today. It's an absolute pleasure to have you, and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule.
No, not at all. Pleasure's all mine, and thanks for having me. Hope I didn't rabbit on too long, and very best of luck with the rest of the episodes.
Well, thank you all for joining me on the first episode of SPECTRE. I'm looking forward to bringing more episodes out. As Johnny mentioned there, you can find the YCL on social medias across Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. Keep up to date or even join them as well. But that's about all the time I've got for today. Looking forward to bringing out a few new episodes out in the coming weeks with some really great guests. So please, by all means, keep your eyes and ears peeled. Feel free to leave them feedback. It would be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much, comrades, and all the best.